Good afternoon, buon pomeriggio. Welcome to everybody. Un cordiale benvenuto a tutti. This is the 27th conference organized by the NATO Foundation in 10 years of life, and the 7th focused on the Balkans and Southeastern Europe. A special thanks to all of you who have chosen to come here in presence. I know how difficult it is, and I thank you for being here. It's a good sign of friendship. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in times of change, and not only on the climate, as everybody says, but in many other areas. The good old times when the world was easy to interpret is gone forever. We have in front of us a fluid international scenario with profound changes, a growing number of vocal actors, diverging agendas, non-state actors of various sorts, different values, and competing forms of government. Parliamentary democracy and liberal Western values do not represent today the majority. In such a world, a good understanding of the game changers, complex and unconnected as they are, is more needed than ever. Historically, the Atlantic Alliance has been a security provider and has grown from 12 original members to 30, with an equal number of partners. NATO has an expertise that has been proven in various occasions and has well served the international community. But the time has come for a serious process of reform. It means more internal cohesion, a permanent dialogue, sharing objectives and threat perceptions, and all this is certainly not an easy task. The process started in 2020 and will continue until the next summit. It goes under the label NATO 2030 and implies a number of objectives. As I said before, it is important to focus our attention on issues of special relevance for the future. And the vast region of the Balkans and the Black Sea comes out as a priority. Southeastern Europe has been for centuries at the crossroads of our history, rich in challenges and opportunities. The Black Sea and the Balkans are connected, and we have decided to have a comprehensive approach in order to show the connections. Europe has a strong interest in this part of the continent, where the end game is full integration. We have divided today's work in three parts. The first panel will focus on the influence of external powers in the region and their strategies. What kind of impact do we observe? What kind of judgment we give, and how to deal with them? The second conversation takes place around the vision that countries in the Black Sea and the Balkans have on regional security. We know that the regional situation is a complex one, and the debate promises to be of real interest, because each country has its own history, its own values, its own perspectives. The third panel will analyze our remaining concern for illicit trade, its ongoing practices for criminal networks, and the gray areas. And unfortunately, they remain a relevant problem. In that respect, regional cooperation remains a primary objective to pursue in parallel with a process of reforms. At the end of the day, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Italian Chamber of Deputies will close the conference. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, we made a big effort in order to put together the best possible experts. And today we have very high caliber personalities as moderators and speakers. And I'm very proud of that, and I wish to thank you all for accepting our invitation in Rome. As usual, our objective is to promote a high-level debate around strategic issues of permanent and common interest in a spirit of respect. The discussion is meant for the general public and not only for specialists. The Foundation, recognized as such by NATO, will continue to develop its activities, focusing on areas of strategic relevance for the international security. And you can also see that from the publication that you found on your seat coming into the room. I conclude thanking, first of all, our entire staff for their enthusiasm and good work in difficult circumstances. Special thanks for their support go to Philip Morris International, the Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation, NATO Public Diplomacy Division, and the College. I thank our media partners for their cooperation, for Mieke, Air Press, European Western Balkans, Most Europe, and others. Vi ringrazio per l'attenzione, buon pomeriggio a tutti e buon lavoro.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ambassador. Hello and a very warm welcome to this first panel today. My name is Alexandra von Namen and I'm delighted and honored to moderate this discussion, and the topic is clearly fascinating. The Balkan and Black Sea region has been one of the main areas of competition for global and regional powers throughout history, but the current battle for supremacy and influence seems to be the most intense in recent memory. And so let's dive directly into it, and I'm very delighted to have distinguished guests with us. So let us give a very warm welcome to Helena Legarda, Senior Analyst with Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin. Great to have you with us. Joining us virtually from the Russian capital is Dmitry Trenin, Director of the Carnegie Center in Moscow. Great to see you, Dmitry. And here in our conference room, please welcome Amer Kapetanovic, Political Director with the Regional Cooperation Council in Sarajevo. Thank you for being with us. So before we start our Q&A session, and I hope that you have prepared questions for us, I would like our speakers to share their insights and views on the topic. And all of you have, or each of you have 7 minutes for a presentation. And maybe we can start with you, Helena. So tell us more about Beijing's goals or actions in the region. They seem to have been successful so far, but maybe we should calm down and just, see whether they can really live up to what they are planning to do here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh,
Do we have a problem with the mic?
seems to not be working.
Okay, can you have mine? It's actually a very good side for such an event to start with a very small technical problem.
Working now? This is what happens when you go from virtual events to in-person events again. Okay. They're going to bring another microphone.
Maybe we can.
It's working now?
It's working. Perfect.
Fantastic. Sorry for the brief interruption. It's fantastic to be here. First of all, I would like to thank the NATO Defense College Foundation for inviting me to this very interesting conference, which is my first in-person event in, I think, almost a year and a half. So it's fantastic to be here and to see people in the audience and everybody willing to engage in such an interesting topic. So on the topic of Beijing's strategy in the Balkans and the Black Sea region, the first thing I would like to say is that China is a newcomer to the region. That's the first thing to note. Its footprint is still quite shallow, but it is rapidly expanding. And this is why it's worth keeping an eye on and considering. Beijing doesn't have a specific regional strategy for the Balkans and the Black Sea region. It doesn't consider that entire region as a single political unit. So it engages with countries mostly bilaterally or through other pre-existing frameworks, such as the 16+1 framework. But mostly, China's engagement in the Balkans and the Black Sea region is part of its broader foreign policy push and ambitions. So here we're talking about the overall foreign policy goal of China under Xi Jinping, which is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. What this goal involves is China becoming a global power by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the People's Republic of China. Why now? Why was this push introduced now? Is because Beijing sees two trends going on at the same time. On the one hand, they feel that this is what they call a period of strategic opportunity for China. So the West is distracted by its own problems that started with the financial crisis back in 2008, continued with the election of populist leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. So China feels that it's got now an opportunity to push and reclaim its position as a global power. In the Chinese Communist Party's ideology and worldview, China was a global power for millennia, and it was a regional hegemon. And the only reason it isn't now is because of what they call the century of humiliation, which is in the 19th century when Western powers imposed unfair treaties on China and partly colonized the country. So in their view, China deserves to be a global power again. That's the natural state of affairs, and it is the Western-dominated global order that is an anomaly that can and must be reversed. So one thing is the period of strategic opportunity. The other trend is that China simultaneously sees a very challenging international environment. It sees growing international backlash. So it's got a perfect window of opportunity to try and push internationally and reclaim its position, with the ultimate goal being becoming a global power again and reforming the global order, the existing global order, in its image. So China wants to ideally dominate the 21st century in the same way that the West, Europe, the United States have dominated the 20th. What this requires is two things. One, increasing China's footprint and influence globally, and two, reducing and eventually replacing the power and influence of the United States and the EU, plus other like-minded allies. With this in mind, it's quite easy to see why the Balkans and the Black Sea region are a very attractive region for China. On the one hand, it provides very clear sort of economic opportunities and political opportunities as a bridgehead into Europe that doesn't have to abide by EU rules when we're talking about economic or infrastructure projects. And it also gives China a chance to obtain sort of European allyship in an increasingly hostile world. So when we're talking about China wanting to expand its footprint and reduce the power and footprint of the EU and the US, the Balkans are great. It's a very attractive region, and it's also very fertile ground. A lot of countries in the region are dissatisfied with the European Union. They feel abandoned by it or even patronized. And China can take advantage of that to sort of step in and occupy that space, with the added advantage that China doesn't have a lot of historical baggage in the region like Russia or the EU or the US do. So given this, it's again very understandable why Beijing wants to get more involved in the Balkans and the Black Sea region. So I said at the beginning, China's footprint is still quite shallow and still mostly limited to the economic domain. So we're talking about a number of infrastructure projects, mostly big ticket items under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. But even those are taking place in some countries more than in others. So Serbia is a very particular example that has received quite a lot of Chinese investment. As a reality check, it's important also to keep in mind that when you compare the investment levels of the European Union to those of China's, the gap is huge. So the EU's investment is much, much larger than China's. But what China does is that it doesn't maintain a very clear separation between economic goals and policies and political and strategic goals. They tend to go hand in hand. So together with all of these economic and infrastructure investments and loans comes increased political engagement and security engagement. What this involves from the Chinese side is close relationships with local elites and national governments to try and gain political influence over these countries and their decisions on the international stage, efforts towards narrative control in the media, social media, also by funding research at universities and private think tanks, etc., and increased security cooperation. And here we can think about police cooperation or arms sales, for example. And again, this is more prevalent in some countries than others, and Serbia here is another example of arms sales arms purchases from China. So I see that my time's running out. The bottom line here is that China's presence is still small, mostly limited to the economic side, but there are very clear political and strategic considerations that are behind all of these economic investments. China as an option or an alternative is proving relatively attractive in the region, and that's something that should make the EU and other actors in the region think twice about why that may be. So fundamentally, as the region tries to balance between the West and China economically, while still trying to sort of remain in the Western sphere of influence politically, that is eventually going to create friction and is going to require that some of the countries make political concessions in one direction or the other. That, in my view, is a position that is going to prove unsustainable going forward in a climate of increasing geopolitical competition. So this is a very good moment for a conference like this to take place and for countries across Europe to start thinking about what China's goals in the Balkans and the Black Sea region are, how they affect us, and what we can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we have the opportunity to talk about that further. But first, let's cross to Moscow. And talking about being a global power, Dmitry Tenin, that is certainly what Russia is aiming for. Russia is active in the region, definitely, and it seems to be now even more aggressive than ever. But the question is there a kind of overstretch? What is your opinion on that?
First of all, I think I should thank you for inviting me over to this conference. I remember almost 30 years ago, I happened to be the first non-NATO senior research fellow at the college, and those were my golden days. Then I had so much more here and so much better prospects that I was looking forward to. Seriously, we're dealing with, from a Russian perspective or Moscow perspective, we're dealing here with two very different regions and of very different importance to Russia. The Black Sea is essentially a region of which Russia itself is part of. And frankly, you cannot overreach yourself in that environment. In the Black Sea region, Russia's strategy is aimed at preventing major security threats from arising. And from the perspective of the Kremlin, the most serious potential threat coming from the Black Sea region could be Ukraine joining NATO or Ukraine hosting US/NATO military bases in its territory. These things seem pretty distant at this moment, pretty remote as threats, but certainly there's one threat that is there and that will remain, and that is the fact that Ukraine has turned into a country which is perhaps more hostile to Russia than any other country in the world. we can talk at length about the reasons for that. We can talk about the policies that Russia pursued toward Ukraine and that region, but that is a subject for, I think, a very different conference. So I would say, talking about the Black Sea region, that certainly areas such as Crimea, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria are all areas where conflicts actually may resume at virtually any moment. And we saw most recently Russia's reaction to the passage of a British ship across the waters that Russia regards as its own, just off Sevastopol. Certainly, these things are very, actually, this is a neuralgic point for Russia. And I think that testing Russia's red lines would lead to a predictable outcome. And frankly, I would not advise people doing that. Abkhazia and South Ossetia look fairly stable. For now, there hasn't been a major flare-up of conflict in either area since the war of 2008. Whereas Transnistria is in a situation, or rather, Transnistria is finding itself in a situation when its future is again in question. And the Western orientation of Chisinau, which has been confirmed in the presidential election last year and the parliamentary election earlier this year, raises the question about what to do with Transnistria. And of course, this is also an area that Russia simply cannot give up without the proper accommodation. And this accommodation is unlikely to come in the foreseeable future. So, in other words, the Black Sea region is an area of high importance for Russia, an area where Russia has been using force, and if provoked, I think it can give an armed response to that provocation. With regard to the Western Balkans, there's not much to say, frankly. This is where Russia can overreach itself if it pursues the policies that historically St. Petersburg and Moscow pursued in the 19th and 20th centuries. Strategically today, the Western Balkans is not an area that poses a threat to Russia or offers any opportunities. This is an area which finds itself in the Western sphere of influence. This gravity, and that includes Serbia, that includes Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That region of Europe is gravitating toward the European Union and NATO. And I think the only strategic decision that Russia made with regard to the Western Balkans was in 2003, when it decided to withdraw its small peacekeeping force from KFOR, from Kosovo. There are tons of history behind Russia's involvement in the Western Balkans, some of it glorious, much of it pretty unfortunate. Actually, Russia's involvement in the Western Balkans was one of the prime reasons for Russia's involvement in the First World War, which led to the huge catastrophe of the downfall of the Russian Empire and everything that followed, the Bolshevik Revolution and all that. So for now, you can see that Russia is essentially using the Western Balkans, particularly Serbia, for public relations reasons, to show that there are pockets of partnership in Europe. There are leaders in Europe that can, at least verbally, rhetorically, defy Western notions about Russia's aggressiveness and be friendly toward Russia. But this is what it is. It's public relations. And I will end by saying that historically, leaders of the Balkans nations have been trying to involve big powers in their disputes, and Russia fell victim to that several times. I hope that this lesson has been learned, and it's somebody else's business, not Russia's. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kapadanovic. So, Mr. Trenin was sort of indicated that Russia has given up with the Western Balkans because there is no threat, no opportunities. How do you see that issue? And of course, let's talk about other actors that are engaged in the region.
First of all, I'll start by thanking the organizers for bringing us here. I mean, it's really nice to be in the eternal city again, and I mean, in person. I mean, after a year and a half of virtual meetings, virtual rooms, seeing people just through the monitor. So thank you very much for this great opportunity. Of course, I mean, we can argue, and I don't go into that much detail whether Russia has given up of the Western Balkans, or it is using Western Balkans simply because it can to wage a geopolitical proxy with the European Union and maybe Euro-Atlantic partners. But I would like to start off by actually contextualizing a little bit the overall debate and my intervention, let alone, because there has always been a great power struggle in the Western Balkans and in different parts of the regions. Now we have a different context, we have a different means of influence, and of course, I would also like us to a little bit embark on discussion why and what is making the Western Balkans so susceptible to the influence of the great powers, over different powers, of alternative narrative, call it whatever. So, I mean, there are, to my humble opinion, a couple of elements that actually are making the Western Balkans rather to be a soft belly of the European Union, rather to be a six-pack of the European Union and Euro-Atlantic geostrategical, let's say, competition. Someone mentioned the enlargement malaise, then of course socioeconomic challenges, then of course crisis of democracy, crisis of liberal democracy, the people that trust less and less to main institutions of democracy in the region has actually created a crack, geopolitical crack in which either EU values will come in and close that crack, or the alternative ones. So I mean, we are at the crossroad, and I agree with Helena pointing out that this is the time when we should reflect and we should really consider what we can do together in order to close this crack, to use the verses as a metaphor here, in order not to have the Western Balkan becoming merely and only geopolitical proxy of a different powers, let alone, and this is something that I would like to highlight, to divert the Western Balkans from this Euro-Atlantic path. Because let me remind us that still, according to Balkan Barometer survey that we conduct every year, more than 60% of people, ordinary citizens of the Western Balkans, they want EU values to prevail. They want to be part of the European Union. So actually, this is a very clear message that we need to go and to understand. Now, what is that makes Western Balkans so susceptible to alternative narratives? I would mention four, but of course, there are much more than that elements. First is socioeconomic. I mean, the Western Balkans is still severely lagging behind the general economic trends in European Union. Economic convergence is so huge that even if European Union goes in hibernation now, and Western Balkans work around the clock for 20 years, we couldn't catch the European Union standard. There are really detrimental statistics of the World Bank that more than 23% of youngsters aged 17 to 23 are not in job, not seeking one, not in education, not in training. They are completely off the major trajectories, socioeconomic, like a ticking bomb, societal ticking bomb. So another element that makes the Western Balkans, so, to just mention this, Western Balkan is hungry for investments in infrastructure. If you look at the OECD rank, the Western Balkans is doing very poorly in terms of infrastructure. They need, of course, pretty much, and most of the countries' economic growth is linked to the foreign direct investments. We can discuss whether it is good or bad, but this is the fact. Political reality, which I mentioned, people are losing trust in the democratic institutions. They are losing the trust in the liberal democracy. They stop thinking and believing that it can bring about a change. According to the last survey of the Balkan Barometer, we ask people what do they think about judiciary. 70% of them deem judiciary corrupted, parliament corrupted, political parties as criminal organizations. This is alarm. And this is actually that crack through which alternative narratives are coming in the Western Balkans. Now I'm speaking about narratives. And this is very, very important. Enlargement has been going on for 20 years if we count the Thessaloniki summit and the promise made there, with no clear results. So what is going on? 62% of people are thinking that they should join the EU. When you ask them when, one-third to one-fourth of them think never. So I mean, this is actually where the alternative narratives kind of getting in and saying to North Macedonians, didn't we tell you, don't go and change your name because you won't get the date for the negotiation. That was wrong. That was strategical blindness of the European Union, if I may call it this way, which we need to correct better sooner than later. What happened to Albania, the message again was negative, although the country embarked on very important judicial reforms that almost put completely to halt the constitutional system due to the vetting procedure of judges. So what we are trying to do at the RCC, the Regional Cooperation, we are addressing these challenges that brought the Western Balkans to be so susceptible to foreign influences, especially alternative narratives. We have come together with the European Union to put together the action plan for the common regional market, to remove all hurdles and barriers for, first of all, freedom of movement among people, academicians, professional people, to create industrial clusters in the Western Balkans, to reconnect the Western Balkans with the EU and global value chain, because it has been completely disrupted, so that new technologies and new knowledge can come in, so that we send the clear message through centers of excellence to those youngsters where ratio is 4 out of 6 think of leaving the region. So we need to recreate the momentum to see, as we showed already through the establishing the free roaming agreement in the Western Balkans, that it can be done according to European values. And I agree, of course, that if you compare what Russia and China and even Gulf countries, because this one of the topic are investing, you can't compare it with the European Union. European Union is giving money through IPA projects. The European Investment and Economic Plan for the Western Balkans is 9 billion euros of IPA fund plus 20 billion euros of financial institution soft loans. Put it in comparison, you would see, but it's not visible there. If you go and ask people on the street, they would say, China is there to help us, Russia is there to help us. So there is a misperception. What went wrong, I don't know, but I think, and I will conclude with this because my time is running, influence of Gulf countries, I mean, is minimal. Honestly, I mean, I don't want to waste your time, but you just look at the statistics and you would see that there is no even incentive through investments and financial means. I know that the story and the high narrative was about influencing, ideological beliefs and religious one, but that was back 20 years ago, back after the war in Bosnia, but it's over now. So all in all, we need to fix those problems that make Western Balkans so susceptible to alternative narratives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is already some responses, applause, but you have drawn a quite pessimistic and dark picture, I would say, talking about ticking bombs, people losing trust. So let me ask you, do you think that the European Union has already lost the battle for the Balkans?
Not yet fully. Not yet fully. But I think we should make rather sooner than later strategic shift. European Union has to be more bold, more courageous while doing it with Western Balkans. It has to open the negotiation with North Macedonia and Albania. It should open the new chapters with Serbia. It should encourage a process in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, those are the mere technical process. It does not mean that these countries will end up tomorrow as EU member states. We are talking about the technical process, which was put to a halt because of a different strategic thinking within the EU. That has to change. European Union has to be more bold in showing what they are ready to do with the Western Balkans. They also need to help us, which they've been doing so far, and we are so grateful, supporting the Common Regional Market Plan, supporting all these actions that we are trying to put together in order to bring about the change in the Western Balkans, so that Western Balkans, so once we close this crack, once we really touch this soft belly, we do the exercise and we make it six-pack of the geostrategic, let's say, outreach of the Western Balkans. Not because we want to European Union to be engaged in the geopolitical proxy and through the Western Balkans, but because people in the region want us to do exactly that. They want better life, they want chances, and the EU is the role model for them. And that's why we have nothing else to do but to deliver what they want us to do.
But if the European Union is too slow, there is China offering probably a good chance for a better life. This offer, it seems to be very attractive for the region, but it's coming with strings. So how, is this lacking European integration playing into the hands of China?
It absolutely is. The lack of real integration prospects and the lack of real actionable alternatives from the EU are creating that space for China to come in and try to present its own models of infrastructure financing, of economic development, even of sort of governance. So it's certainly creating that space, and I completely agree that it's high time for the EU to step in and create, again, clear alternatives for the region, because otherwise you let China come in and do so. The issue with the Chinese alternative is that it's not always as substantial or as real as it seems. There's clear issues with some of the projects that China finances when we're talking about Belt and Road Initiative projects. There's concerns regarding standards, both in terms of sort of the environment, but also financial sustainability. There's loads of opportunities to fuel corruption and to sort of undermine, to a certain extent, the chances even for EU accession and integration in the future. A lot of these investments from China, which tend to be in the form of loans, I would argue are largely amoral. So as long as Chinese companies benefit from them, and these are state-owned enterprises, but as long as they benefit from them, China tends to leave a lot of the details on implementation to the recipient country, which can work very well, or it can create a lot of opportunities for corruption, mismanagement, judicial issues, etc. So there's a lot of concerns there, and the issues tend to come in when we look at the amount of money that some of these countries are borrowing from China. Some people call it debt trap diplomacy. I would personally not use that term. I don't think that's China's goal here. But the concern is if a small country in the Balkans or the Black Sea region takes out a loan from China for a big infrastructure project, very often, either because of inflated costs or often because of poor planning, so projects that either there was no financial viability study or it was done, but the project was accepted and the loan was taken anyway, even though it was deemed economically non-viable. It's small countries that end up with very large loans, which represent a very high percentage of their GDP that realistically they cannot repay. Montenegro is a very kind of recent case in point here. And then what happens then? when a country in the Balkans owes a lot of money to China, to a Chinese state-owned bank or enterprise. In some cases, there are clauses regarding asset seizures, but that's actually quite rare. So that hasn't happened all that often. There was the example of a port in Sri Lanka. There's rumors that apparently it was similar in Montenegro. So if Montenegro couldn't pay, China had the right to sort of seize quite a bit of land for a number of years. In a lot of cases, instead of that, it ends up being a renegotiation of the debt. But then we enter into this dynamic in which China is helping the country and sort of doing them favor by renegotiating the debt. And there are certain political concessions that will be expected in return going forward. So it provides China with a certain amount of political leverage over national governments. And of course, from a European Union or a NATO perspective, the concerns are multiple, right? So we start from, again, making the process of integration or accession into the EU or NATO not just harder, but in some countries delaying it very substantially, undermining EU and NATO influence, undermining rule of law and EU values, norms, and principles through lack of transparency, through low standards. And then all of this potential political leverage that China gains in these countries brings up the fear of sort of Trojan horses to a certain extent. So what happens with some of these countries that are maybe already NATO members, or with countries that are maybe not EU member states yet, but they're hoping to accede in the future? So if the EU doesn't step in now and sort of tries to tackle some of the strategic considerations behind China's involvement in the region, we're probably going to land in a situation where China has gained quite a lot of political leverage over a number of governments that may then want to accede into the EU. And that complicates the picture very substantially from a European and a NATO perspective.
But talking about NATO, Mr. Trenin, you said, and security in the region, you said that one shouldn't test Russia's red lines. But of course, there's also the European Union's red lines, NATO's red lines maybe. So how big is the risk of a situation escalating, of a military confrontation in the Black Sea?
Well, I think that the risk is not negligible. I wouldn't exaggerate it. I think that all the powers that you have mentioned are led by responsible people, and they will not take decisions lightly that could bring Russia and NATO to a collision, a real kinetic collision, which is something I worry most about. I think that we are learning to live in an environment of confrontation, which I think will take a long time to play itself out. This confrontation originated between the United States and Russia. I think it now fully covers NATO and Russia, and even the European Union and Russia. So you can do two things with confrontation that you cannot end. At least not, you cannot end it in the foreseeable future. One is to manage that confrontation, and the other one is to mismanage the confrontation. So I think that the meeting in Geneva between Presidents Putin and Biden was a good opportunity to exchange each other's red lines. But these red lines, of course, are there not only to be presented, but if need be, to be defended in the full sense of the word. So you have to be very careful with your red lines. You cannot simply draw something in the sand and then step back when something happens. And I think that we're already witnessing some elements of better management of the situation as we are talking. right now, there's a meeting going on not far from Rome, again in Geneva, between the deputy foreign ministers of Russia and the United States to kick off a dialogue on strategic stability. This is a good thing. We also need to be careful with various incidents that can lead to collisions. There has to be an effort has to be made between Russia and NATO to make sure that these incidents are prevented, and if they happen, they should be immediately prevented from escalating to a conflict. And I also mentioned political situations that can lead toward some sort of tensions that neither Russia nor NATO countries, including the United States, want at this point. And we talk about Ukraine, we talk about Moldova, we talk about Georgia. I think that people, as I said, people are learning to manage this confrontation. It's a bad thing, but it's best to try to manage a bad thing rather than simply neglect it and let it become even worse.
However, it's also very risky to manage confrontations. Let us speed up our discussion, and we welcome you to ask your questions. We have 2 open mics. Please, there is one of the mics. If you can just go there if it's not too uncomfortable, and ask your questions.
Good afternoon.
Okay.
My name is
You
Carlo
can be the
Trezza
second, sorry.
from Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. My question goes to Dmitry Trenin. After the end of the Cold War, we in Europe were under the impression that Russia was rather tolerant vis-à-vis an expansion of the European Union in countries which were under Russian or Soviet influence, let's say, whereas Russia was more concerned about the expansion of NATO to those countries. Now, do you think that this kind of rule, this attitude still remains valid today, or is it changing? Does the enlargement of the European Union towards these countries create more problems than some years ago? Thank you.
Can I answer now, or how do you want to, Alexander, how do you want to manage that?
Now.
Now, okay. I think you're right. Initially, Russia was sort of, not really welcoming, but more tolerant toward the EU expansion, until it learned that EU expansion was something that, unlike the NATO thing, involved so many practical issues that have to be hammered out in a very serious way. And the Russians learned that with regard to the exclave in Kaliningrad, that is totally surrounded on land by EU member states. But Russia and the EU managed that situation, and it's not a problem. It has not been a problem ever since. So 15 plus years of EU membership for Lithuania and Poland have not created problems for Kaliningrad. With regard to NATO, the situation was different and continues to be different. The problem with the EU enlargement is, well, first of all, it's not something that many Russians believe is likely in the foreseeable future. If you talk about EU membership for Ukraine or Georgia, this is not on the agenda, and who knows when it will be on the agenda. So this is not a pressing issue. However, there hasn't been a case of the European Union inviting a former communist country to its fold, or accepting a former communist country, unless that country had already joined NATO. So in order for the European Union to operate safely, that's my reading of it, the country in question should be secured through NATO membership. And the two things are joined at the hip. There hasn't been a case of an EU enlargement toward a former communist country that had not been preceded by NATO enlargement. The cases of Finland and Austria, that Russia essentially did not object to, did not involve former communist countries. Neither Finland nor Austria had to be secured before they were admitted to the EU. So that would be my question. That would be my answer to your question. I think that's essentially it's as valid today, opposition to NATO enlargement as it was then. However, there is a belief that NATO membership for Ukraine is not something round the corner, but people are watching very closely.
Much. Maybe we have one more question from the floor. Maybe I can ask you to keep it short and also the answers.
My name is
bit shorter.
Fatima, former defense minister and member of parliament of Albania. I have a question for Ms. Lagarde regarding the issue of having a plan how to challenge, what's going on with China in Europe and especially in the Balkans. In 2015 was launched the idea of 3 Seas initiative, which connects Baltic Sea, Black Sea, and also Adriatic Sea. 12 countries are part of it. How visible you think is this initiative, considering their projects of infrastructure, North-South corridor, liquid gas coming, and also digital? And adding to that, what do you think about 5G with Huawei?
Thanks for those questions. Two very, very different ones. Starting with the first one, I mean, that initiative, sure, it's visible, that's clear, but what China's taken advantage of is precisely what was said earlier, that there's a lot of hunger for infrastructure investment in the region. So regardless of these initiatives, and long as there's more demand and there's space, China's gonna still come in and offer. These countries need infrastructure investment in the Balkans and the Black Sea region, and China, first of all, these investments and these loans aren't directly mandated from Beijing. These are state-owned enterprises that go in, see opportunities, and because of commercial aims, they go and bid. So again, as long as there's demand, this is going to continue to happen. The concern is sort of the geopolitical and strategic elements and strengths that sort of come with these investments. You can't really separate one from the other. So the 3 Seas initiative, I take your point, but the Belt and Road Initiative is there, and as long as there's space and there's demand, they're going to keep bidding for projects. And a lot of the issue here, what China promises is development without too many constraints and too many demands. And this is what's complicated for the European Union, and I'll keep it short because we're running out of time, but when the EU kind of loans money for projects or for economic development, there are certain conditions regarding environmental standards, local content standards, regarding financial sustainability, regarding rule of law. Chinese investments and loans tend to not have those, which is why they're often very attractive at first glance. It's just easier, and it's faster. So what's needed is not necessarily, we don't want to race to the bottom. We don't want the EU to eliminate all these conditions and requirements. We need to find a way to maybe expedite the process and make it just easier for countries in the region to get access to some of those funds. An additional issue here that I didn't have time to discuss is that China tends to overpromise and then sometimes underdeliver. And that's something that we've seen, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, 16+1 countries. I can imagine that that's going to start to happen also in the Balkans and the Black Sea region. There's long been this sort of narrative or this take that if you make political concessions to China, if you're politically close to Beijing, you're going to get economic benefits out of that. That's not really happening. And again, this is a narrative problem. This is what we need to get out there and and make clear, and it's not just the EU that needs to go and tell this story in the Balkans. This needs to come from the region. There needs to be an assessment of whether this is working or not working, and what can be done. I mean, the Chinese alternative seems very good on paper. In reality, it doesn't seem to be as good of an option. And that comes across in the parameters that were mentioned earlier, right? Yes, the China alternative is there, but most people in the region would still prefer the EU. And quickly on Huawei and 5G, we're running out of time, so I won't have a lot of time, but happy to discuss after in the coffee break. Huawei and 5G, it's a fairly large issue. Fundamentally, there are clear concerns with regards to Huawei simply because of its integration into kind of the broader foreign policy and sort of national interest and national security structures and interests of China. So there are very clear security concerns when it comes to having Huawei be too involved in 5G networks in Europe. Some of them are a bit more strategic. Some of them are actually quite clearly security related. My personal take here is that every country, as the EU effectively has left it up to the member states and outside of the EU, every country needs to have a very clear picture and a very clear view of what the security status of their networks are, what operators and suppliers can do and what sort of data they can access. And there needs to be very clear legislation as to what sort of actors and what sort of companies should be allowed to bid for these or not. And those conditions can't just be commercial. There needs to be political and strategic considerations in play when we're looking at those criteria. Again, happy to discuss further in the coffee break. I don't want to take up the entire time for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one question from our virtual audience, a question that I don't see in the moment. Maybe you can show it to me. Okay, so we decided to take one more question from the floor. Please go ahead.
Dobry wieczór. Good evening. It's a question to Professor Trenin. It's about the so we can assume that expansion of Europe and expansion of NATO are two different topics. However, the involvement of Russia may be in the strategy of defense of Balkans, may be a possible topic of discussion with NATO in a perspective of fight against terrorism, cyber terrorism, and confessional terrorism, and so connect also Russia with the and Eurasian country with the NATO country and Balkan country, and respect also of the sovereignty of Serbia. May be possible.
Well, if I may, I'm not sure I fully understand the issue, but my take is that business between NATO and Russia are essentially about preventing bad things to happen that could lead to a collision, physical collision between Western and Russian military forces. Russia is certainly open to collaborating on anti-terrorism, but as I understand, a lot of countries have in NATO have dialed back their collaboration with Russia on that issue after Ukraine and other crises of the past several years. So this is not really a question that Russians would be answering. So that would be my answer to the question. I don't think that if your question was about trilateral, if you like, collaboration among NATO, Balkan countries, and Russia on the fight against terrorism, I think that Russia, in principle, is open to that. There's a big issue, clearly, as there always is in the fight against terrorism, who is a terrorist, because we have different lists and different understandings of who qualifies as terrorist in Russia, Europe, the United States, and third countries.
Very true that we have different definitions there, but we have one more question. I think it's for you, Mr. Kapetonovic.
Good evening. My name is Gaetano Massara. I'm the former CEO of General Electric in Southeast Europe, in the Western Balkans. So I have a question for Mr. Kapetanovic. You rightly spoke about the misperception or the wrong narrative across the region about EU, about the EU in general. In particular, the fact that Russia, China, and even Turkey are perceived as better and closer partners to the countries of the region instead of the European Union. We know that this is a flawed narrative because the European Union is by far the largest investor and supporter of the region. But on the other hand, we know that there is a EU enlargement fatigue, as witnessed and confirmed by President Macron. Don't you think that the accession process to the European Union should be changed in order to show some tangible commitment and progress to the countries of the region, to the Western Balkans 6, in terms of progress to the accession? More precisely, we know that there are 35 chapters, 35 acquis communautaires. Don't you think that a staged accession process where, you know, as one country fulfills one chapter, it can access the European Union in that specific field, in that specific, you know, subject, leaving the fulfillment of the other chapters, you know, still open and to be achieved, fulfilled at a later stage? And then the second question quickly is, we know that the mother of all issues in the region is Kosovo. Recently there have been 2 non-papers on the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue and how to resolve the Kosovo issue. What is your opinion on that? And in particular, you know, a sort of a larger degree of autonomy for northern Kosovo, for the Mitrovica region, following the South Tyrol Alto Adige model, or even the partition of Kosovo, or even the unification between a large part of Kosovo and Albania, etc., etc. I'm sure that you know the story very well.
3 questions then.
Yeah, three. I'll shorten it up by saying that actually I agree with you, with your comment on the new approach in the enlargement. Yes, that could be one of the options, as it was also somehow, you know, covered by one of the non-papers related to the new enlargement process towards the Western Balkans. Definitely. I cannot agree more with you that some new energy is necessary and important, especially in this critical time where people start to think that they are being abandoned by the European Union, that they are being left outside of the scope of the possibility to, in foreseeable future, become part of the European Union. So that kind of creative energy, I would call it, from the European Union is very important. No doubt about it. So I can go and comment, but I agree with you. I mean, that could be one of the models. You know that the European Union has, the European Commission has adopted the new enlargement methodology, which is clearly linked with the progress in different chapters, with more money. More money is, however, needed much more than foreseen by IPA, honestly. So definitely some bringing actually the Western Balkan leaders and Western Balkan representatives to be more active in sitting around the same table with colleagues from the European Union when they are discussing about future policies of the European Union towards the Balkans and towards the future of the European Union is more than welcome. So I mean that would send us a good signal. Speaking in the language of let's say, these policy papers and the expectations. On Kosovo, however, Yeah, you're right. I mean, we are stumbling really in the regional dynamics, a lot of unresolved issues in Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, and that's the fact. This is emanating the negative energy all the time. It has a spilling over effect on every other line of intervention and what we want to achieve. But honestly, I mean, I wouldn't discover anything. This is any piece of wisdom. This is just a given fact that it can only be sorted out through dialogue. And as long as Pristina and Belgrade do not sit together and find a compromise solution, I'm afraid you can't impose on them anything. So what we are trying actually to do, and this is really, I mean, we are trying to have a different approach, to showcase both to Belgrade and to Pristina and other stakeholders that we can do certain things, even there is a disagreement on the most substantial ones. I will be more precise. Can you imagine? Briefly, I'll finish with this. That both Pristina and Belgrade signed the agreement, the regional agreement on abolishing the surcharges for the roaming in the Western Balkans. So it is possible. Can you imagine that both Belgrade and Pristina sent the delegation to negotiate freedom of movement with ID cards in the Western Balkans? So this is another given proof that it is possible. But most substantial issues related to the status, it has to be sorted out bilaterally with clear engagement of Belgrade and Pristina and clear support of European Union and United States together.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we need to wrap up. Thank you very much for this very fascinating discussion. And thank you for listening. Thank you for watching online. Now we will have a 30-minute break, and then we will be back with our next panel at 5 p.m. online. Thank you.